History is filled with battles, conquests, and victories that are recorded in great detail. We can trace the rise of empires, the fall of kings, and the clash of armies across centuries. Yet every so often, we encounter a story that defies explanation. A story that slips between fact and legend, leaving us with more questions than answers. One such mystery comes from the pages of Herodotus, the Greek historian who lived in the 5th century before our era. He is remembered as the father of history, yet his writings often carry the flavor of folklore, where truth and myth intertwine. Among his many accounts, there is one that has haunted the imagination of readers for over 2,000 years. It is the tale of an army, an entire force of 50,000 men that marched into the desert and was never seen again. Herodotus tells us that in the reign of Cambyses II, the mighty son of Cyrus the Great and ruler of the Persian Empire, a great host of soldiers was dispatched into the western deserts of Egypt. Their task seemed simple: to reach the distant oasis of Siwa, where stood the sacred temple of Amun. The priests there had refused to acknowledge Cambyses as the rightful king of Egypt, and for this defiance, they were to be punished. The king's wrath was great, and his word was law. And so, under the burning sun, the army began its march. 50,000 men, accompanied by pack animals, provisions, and the weight of imperial pride, moved steadily into the wilderness. Yet, as Herodotus writes, they would never reach their destination. Somewhere in the sea of shifting sands, they disappeared without a trace. This is not a story of a single soldier lost or a small company defeated in battle. It is the story of an entire army vanishing into silence. No bones left behind, no shattered weapons, no burial mounds. Only the unbroken horizon of the desert, stretching endlessly, as though it had swallowed them whole. For centuries, travelers and scholars have wondered what happened to them. Was it a sandstorm of such violence that it buried the soldiers alive, sealing them beneath dunes that would never give up their dead? Was it hunger, thirst, and exhaustion that slowly destroyed the force, leaving nothing but scattered remains, soon hidden by the winds? Or was Herodotus himself misled, perhaps weaving rumor and imagination into the tapestry of history? We may never know, but even the lack of certainty gives this story its power. There is something unsettling in the thought that human ambition, no matter how vast, can be silenced so completely, leaving behind only whispers carried on the desert wind. Tonight, we will follow this story step by step. We will begin with Cambyses himself, the ambitious, often cruel ruler who inherited the Persian throne. We will walk with his soldiers as they set out on their fateful journey. We will hear the roar of the desert storm, and we will pause to consider the theories, both ancient and modern, that attempt to explain the fate of the lost army. It is not only a tale of history, it is a meditation on mystery, on the fragility of human life, and on the eternal silence of the desert. And so, as we begin, imagine the endless horizon of Egypt before you, the heat shimmering in the air, the sands stretching beyond sight. Imagine 50,000 men, banners waving, armor gleaming, voices echoing across the wastes. And then, imagine silence. The silence of an army that marched into the desert and never returned. To understand the story of the vanished army, we must first look at the man who sent them into the sands. Cambyses II was not just any king. He was the son of Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Persian Empire. Cyrus had created something the world had never seen before, a realm stretching from the Aegean Sea to the mountains of Central Asia, ruled with a mix of tolerance, strength, and vision. To his people, Cyrus was a father figure, remembered with respect even by those he had conquered. Cambyses inherited this vast empire in a year 530 before Christ, but the shadow of his father's greatness weighed heavily on him. Cyrus had been a ruler of wisdom, admired by Greeks and Persians alike. Cambyses, by contrast, was remembered as harsher, more volatile, and often consumed by anger. Herodotus describes him as a man of sudden rages, prone to cruelty, and sometimes driven to madness. Whether this was entirely true or shaped by Greek storytelling, we cannot say for certain. But the image of Cambyses that comes down to us is one of a king eager to prove himself, and perhaps even more eager to dominate. The greatest prize within his reach was Egypt. In Cambyses' time, Egypt was already ancient, a land of temples, pyramids, and traditions older than Persia itself. To rule Egypt was to hold one of the most prestigious thrones in the known world. And so, in 525 BCE, Cambyses led his forces against the pharaoh Psamtik III. The campaign was swift and brutal. At the Battle of Pelusium, Persian archers drove animals before their ranks, using sacred cats and other creatures the Egyptians revered to sow confusion. The pharaoh was defeated, Memphis fell, and Egypt became a province of the Persian Empire. Yet conquest did not bring Cambyses peace. Herodotus tells us that he grew restless, filled with suspicion of Egypt's priests and traditions. He scorned their gods, mocked their rituals, and sought to bend them beneath his will. Among the temples that troubled him most was the distant shrine of Amun, located far across the desert in the oasis of Siwa. There, the priests claimed to speak the words of their god, and they refused to acknowledge Cambyses as Egypt's rightful king. To Cambyses, this was not merely an insult. It was a challenge to his authority, a defiance that could not be ignored. But the desert is unlike any enemy. It does not fight with swords or shields. It waits. It exhausts. It blinds. Its silence can be more terrifying than the clash of steel. For the desert wears down not just the body, but the mind. And Cambyses, perhaps blinded by his anger, did not see this danger clearly. For the soldiers chosen, the order was both an honor and a burden. To serve the king was a duty, yet to march into the unknown was a trial. They gathered their supplies, their weapons, and their hopes, preparing for the journey that lay ahead. None could have imagined that they were stepping into a story that would echo through history as one of its greatest mysteries. As they assembled outside the city, the hot Egyptian sun beat down upon them, shimmering across the sands. Ahead lay the endless horizon. Behind them, the world of men, the Nile, the cities, the temples, seemed to fade into memory. They were about to leave the familiar and enter the domain of the desert. And somewhere, far ahead, in that sea of sand, waited their fate. Far out in the western desert of Egypt, beyond the fertile valley of the Nile, lies an oasis known as Siwa. Even today, it feels remote, isolated from the rest of the world by vast seas of sand. In ancient times, it was more than a simple oasis. It was a place of pilgrimage, a site of mystery, and above all, the home of a sacred oracle. The Oracle of Amun was revered across the Mediterranean. Amun, the great god of hidden things, had long been worshipped by the Egyptians. At Siwa, his temple stood as both sanctuary and throne of prophecy. Priests there claimed they could speak the words of the god himself, offering guidance to kings and travelers alike. Their reputation was such that rulers from distant lands would send emissaries to seek their counsel. Even centuries later, Alexander the Great would make his way to Siwa, eager to hear the oracle proclaim him the son of Zeus Ammon. But in the days of Cambyses II, the priests of Ammon posed a problem. They were respected by Egyptians far and wide, and their voices carried weight. When Cambyses conquered Egypt, he demanded that every priesthood and temple acknowledge him as pharaoh, the living ruler of the two lands. Most complied, though reluctantly, but at Siwa, the oracle refused. They would not bend to the foreign king. They would not call him divine. For Cambyses, this was more than stubbornness. It was a public insult, an open rejection of his claim to rule Egypt as its rightful pharaoh. And in a world where divine favor was believed to shape the fate of empires, such defiance was dangerous. How could he claim legitimacy if one of the most revered oracles in the land openly denied him? Thus, his wrath grew. The decision was made. The temple must be destroyed, its priests silenced, its oracle humbled or erased. In ordering this, Cambyses was not merely acting as a conqueror. He was challenging the very gods of Egypt. One can imagine how the story might have sounded in the ears of the soldiers. To march against other men was one thing, to march against a god was another. Perhaps they whispered among themselves as they prepared, wondering what kind of fate awaited those who dared to defile the house of Ammon. Yet they had no choice. The command came from the king himself, and disobedience was not an option in the Persian Empire. So it was that 50,000 men assembled to begin their long march across the sands. They carried provisions, water skins, dried food, tools for building fires. They brought their shields and spears, for though they expected no armies to oppose them, the desert itself was a kind of enemy. The officers gave orders, the soldiers adjusted their burdens, and slowly the great column began to move westward. Behind them, the Nile shimmered in the sunlight, its green banks alive with the crops and villages that had flourished there for millennia. Ahead of them stretched a different world. The desert was not merely empty, it was alive in its own way. The wind swept across the dunes, shifting them silently, erasing tracks as though no one had ever passed. The heat rose in shimmering waves, bending the horizon. To march into such a place was to enter another realm, one where human ambition seemed small compared to the vastness of nature. And yet, Cambyses demanded it. The temple of Ammon must fall. The god must be silenced. The will of Persia must prevail. The soldiers marched on, step by step, their destination hidden somewhere far beyond the horizon. None of them could have guessed that the oracle, though untouched by their hands, would be vindicated in a way no one expected. For while the priests of Amun remained in their distant sanctuary, it was the army itself that would soon vanish, leaving the desert with a mystery that endures to this day. The order was given, and the army began its march. 50,000 men, stretched into a long line that wound its way from the green valley of the Nile into the barren world beyond. At first, the path was firm, the land still touched by the life-giving river. But with each step westward, the signs of water faded, and the earth grew dry, cracked, and unforgiving. For the soldiers, the change was immediate. The cool breezes that sometimes drifted along the Nile were gone, replaced by a still, heavy air that pressed against their chests. The fertile fields gave way to sand and stone, the horizon broken only by the wavering mirages that rose under the blazing sun. It was as though they had crossed an invisible threshold from the world of men into the kingdom of the desert. The march began in discipline. Officers barked orders, soldiers kept their ranks, and the column advanced with the steady rhythm of an empire accustomed to war. The Persians had crossed mountains before, endured winters and long campaigns, and conquered distant peoples. To them, this was another task, another order from their king. And yet, there was something unsettling about the silence of the desert. No villages greeted them, no fields offered rest, only an endless expanse that seemed to stretch forever. Day after day, they pressed forward. The sun blazed overhead, its heat so fierce that armor became unbearable to wear for long hours. Some soldiers wrapped cloth around their helmets and shields to keep from burning their hands. The animals too, camels, donkeys, and pack mules, labored under the weight of provisions, their tongues lolling as they searched for water that was not there. At night, the desert transformed. The scorching heat gave way to a sudden chill, the air sharp and dry, The soldiers built fires from the little wood they carried, huddling around the flames as the stars blazed above them with a brilliance few had ever seen.
In the stillness of night, the desert seemed even larger, as though it was swallowing their voices, their footsteps, even their thoughts. As they marched, some men began to whisper. The priests of Amun were said to wield great power. Could it be that the god himself watched their progress, waiting to strike? Others dismissed such fears, saying that the desert was their only true enemy. Yet even the bravest could not deny a growing unease. For in the desert, the line between superstition and reality grows thin. A mirage of water on the horizon could look like salvation, until it dissolved into sand beneath weary feet.
Supplies became a constant concern. Water skins grew lighter each day, and though the officers had calculated carefully, the desert was vast and its distances deceptive. The men rationed their drinks, wetting their lips sparingly. Hunger gnawed, though it was thirst that haunted them most. A soldier could march on an empty stomach, but without water, strength would fail quickly. Still, the orders were clear, and the soldiers obeyed. To falter was to risk punishment, and besides, the pride of Persia was behind them. Who could believe that 50,000 men might be defeated, not by an army, but by emptiness? They told themselves that the oasis lay ahead, that soon they would find rest, shade, and water. Each morning they rose with that hope, but as the days passed, the desert gave no sign of mercy. The horizon never changed, always distant, always shimmering with illusions. The sands shifted beneath their feet, erasing the footprints of the day before. It was as if the desert itself wished to conceal their presence, to pretend they had never been there at all. And so the army marched deeper and deeper into the unknown, step by step, leaving the world of men behind. None among them could know that with every mile they traveled, they were moving closer to a fate from which there would be no return. The desert has a way of testing endurance more cruelly than any battlefield. An enemy army may be fierce, but at least it can be seen, its numbers counted, its strength measured. The desert gives no such comfort. It stretches endlessly, featureless and deceptive, its dangers hidden in silence. And as the days of marching turned into weeks, the Persian soldiers began to feel the full weight of its power. The heat was relentless. By mid-morning, the sun already hung overhead like a hammer, pressing down on helmets and armor until the metal seared against skin. Soldiers learned to wrap their cloaks over their shoulders, not for warmth, but for protection against the burning touch of their own gear. The glare of the sand was just as punishing. Bright and blinding, it reflected the sunlight so fiercely that men squinted through slits and cloth tied across their faces. Eyes ached, lips cracked, skin blistered. Water grew scarce. The rationing became harsher with each passing day. Officers measured out the contents of the skins with precision, allowing only enough to keep the men alive and moving. The animals suffered too. Camels, though resilient, staggered under their loads, while mules collapsed in the heat, their bodies quickly claimed by the circling scavenger birds. Each loss meant fewer supplies carried forward, and each death reminded the soldiers of their own fragile condition. The food, too, was little comfort. Dried meat, hard bread, a handful of dates, meals were reduced to what could be carried and preserved. But hunger was not their greatest fear. It was thirst that haunted every step. Thirst that made men lick their cracked lips and glance at the horizon with desperate hope. Time and again, mirages appeared, shimmering lakes in the distance, glimmers of palm trees swaying. Each time, the soldiers' hearts leapt, only to sink again as the illusions melted into sand. Exhaustion became a constant companion. The rhythm of marching grew slower, the lines more ragged. Men fell behind, stumbling in the soft sand, their legs heavy as if weighed down by chains. Some collapsed outright, their comrades pausing only long enough to see whether they might rise again. Most did not, and the desert was merciless. Within hours, the wind covered their bodies, leaving nothing but shifting dunes where once a man had walked. At night, when the fires were lit, the whispers began. Soldiers spoke of omens, of gods angered by Cambyses' commands. They told each other stories of spirits that haunted the desert, of voices that called from the dunes, of shadows that moved at the edge of vision. Some swore they heard the priests of Ammon in their dreams, warning them to turn back before it was too late. Others dismissed such tales as weakness, insisting that the army of Persia could not be undone by superstition. But even the bravest men grew uneasy, for the desert has a way of seeping into the mind, filling silence with dread. The officers tried to keep order, urging the soldiers forward, reminding them of the glory of the empire and the certainty of victory. Yet even they could not deny the strain. Every day seemed longer than the last, and the distances they crossed felt endless. The desert gave no landmarks, no signs of progress, only the same rolling dunes, the same burning sky. Still, the march continued. They had been told that Siwa awaited them, with its oasis of water and its temple of Amun. The thought of that green haven pulled them onward like a distant star, a promise of relief after endless suffering. And so they pressed forward, step by step, their bodies weakening, their hope stretched thin. But the desert was patient. It waited as it always had, silent and eternal. And soon it would reveal just how small even 50,000 men could be beneath its vast, shifting sands. There are moments in history when nature itself seems to rise against human ambition. Battles are forgotten, monuments crumble, but the memory of a storm that swallows men whole, can linger for millennia. Herodotus tells us that such a storm came upon the army of Cambyses II, and it came without warning. The soldiers had been marching for many days. Their bodies were worn, their supplies dwindling, yet still they pressed on. The desert stretched endlessly before them, its dunes shifting like waves upon a golden sea. Then, on one fateful day, the horizon darkened. At first, it seemed a cloud, perhaps even a rare blessing of rain. Men shaded their eyes and pointed. A murmur spread through the ranks. Could relief finally be at hand? But the cloud grew larger, darker, heavier. It was not the promise of water. It was the threat of destruction. The wind rose suddenly, tugging at cloaks, lifting the sand in little eddies at their feet. The animals grew restless, their ears twitching, their eyes rolling in fear. Officers barked orders, trying to steady the line, but already the desert was stirring, as if awakening from a long sleep. And then it struck. The wind roared with a voice like thunder, sweeping across the open plain. Sand lifted in great sheets, stinging the skin like a storm of needles. Visibility vanished. Men who had been walking side by side could no longer see one another. The sun disappeared behind a wall of dust, and the world turned the color of fire and shadow. The soldiers tried to shield themselves. They pulled their cloaks over their heads, pressed their faces against the ground, clutched at their shields for cover. But the storm did not relent. It screamed around them, tearing at tents, toppling pack animals, scattering provisions into the air. Sand filled mouths and nostrils, choking the breath from men who struggled to inhale. It filled ears, eyes, and the joints of armor, grinding like a relentless machine. Hours passed, or perhaps it was only minutes. In a storm such as this, time lost meaning. Men clung to one another, shouting, but their voices were torn away by the wind. Some tried to move forward, others back. But in the swirling chaos, all direction was lost. North, south, east, west. It was all the same. Only the howling gale remained. And then came the dunes. The wind piled the sand in great drifts, swallowing men where they lay. A soldier who knelt for shelter found the dune rising over him, burying him grain by grain. Entire companies disappeared beneath the shifting earth, their cries silenced, their bodies entombed. Camels bellowed as they sank, kicking helplessly before the sand closed over them. Herodotus writes simply that the army was engulfed by the storm and vanished. But one can imagine the terror of that final moment, the desperation, the hopeless struggle, the realization that no strength of man could withstand the breath of a desert. When at last the winds subsided, the desert was silent once more. The sun shone down upon a landscape transformed, the dunes reshaped as though no one had ever passed. The footprints, the campfires, the bodies, all were gone. 50,000 men had marched into the desert, and not a single one remained. To the priests of Amun, it must have seemed as if the god himself had stretched out his hand. No army came to desecrate their temple. No foreign king's wrath reached their sanctuary. The desert had spoken, and its judgment was final. And so the army of Cambyses II became a whisper on the wind, a memory carried only in rumor and in the words of Herodotus. Whether buried beneath the dunes or scattered to the four corners of the earth, they left behind no trace. Only the mystery endures, as deep and silent as the sands that claimed them. When we turn to the writings of Herodotus, we step into a world where history, memory, and myth are woven together like threads in a tapestry. He was not simply a collector of facts. He was a storyteller, a man who believed that history was more than dates and battles. To Herodotus, history was alive, filled with wonders, warnings, and mysteries. The destructions were punished by both this country, the desire of the greats with Lispens. But somewhere between Thebes and Siwa, they disappeared. According to Herodotus, a great sandstorm rose up from the desert, a storm so vast and merciless that it buried the soldiers where they stood. Not a trace remained, and the desert claimed them forever. For Herodotus, this was not merely a tale of men lost in the sands. It was a warning, a parable about arrogance and the limits of human power. But to challenge the gods, to defy the sacred order of the world, was to invite destruction. The Persians may have wielded armies, empires, and wealth, but against the breath of the desert, they were powerless. And yet, Herodotus does not dwell only on the supernatural. He writes with a curiosity that suggests he himself wondered what really happened. He admits that the desert is vast and unforgiving, that men can vanish into it without leaving a trace. Perhaps it was not the wrath of Amun, but the ordinary cruelty of nature that sealed the army's fate. Heat, thirst, and exhaustion may have done their work long before the sandstorm finished what hunger and despair had begun. Still, to his readers, the image of an army swallowed whole by the sands was unforgettable. The story spread, retold in marketplaces, in temples, and in royal courts. To the Egyptians, it confirmed what they had always known. The gods protected their sacred lands. To the Greeks, it was a reminder that even the greatest empire in the world could be humbled. And to us, centuries later, it remains one of the most haunting mysteries of antiquity. Herodotus left us with more questions than answers. Was he recounting a true event, passed down to him by Egyptian priests? Or was he embellishing, shaping a tale that would echo through the ages? We may never know. But in his words, the desert comes alive, not just as a place of silence and emptiness, but as a living force, capable of erasing even the mightiest of armies. And so, the mystery of the vanished soldiers lived on, carried in the ink of Herodotus's pages, waiting for future generations to wonder, to doubt, and to dream. Centuries passed, and yet the mystery of Cambyses' lost army refused to fade into silence. Travelers, scholars, and dreamers all carried the story with them as they crossed the deserts of Egypt. The sands themselves seemed to whisper of the soldiers buried beneath, their shields, their spears, and their bones hidden far below the shifting dunes. In the Middle Ages, merchants traveling the caravan routes told of finding strange fragments, bronze weapons, scraps of cloth, even black box bones, half emerging from the desert floor after a storm. These discoveries fueled the legend, making it seem less like myth and more like a puzzle left unsolved. For some, these remnants were proof that the tale of Herodotus was true. For others, they were mere coincidences, the remains of smaller bands of wanderers swallowed by the same cruel wilderness. The Renaissance brought new fascination. European explorers and scholars, enchanted by the stories of antiquity, dreamed of finding the lost army. Maps were drawn with dotted lines across the desert, speculating where 50,000 men might have marched and where they might have vanished. Still, no one could say for certain. The desert guarded its secrets well. In the modern age, archaeologists and adventurers set out with renewed determination. Some claim to have stumbled upon arrowheads and pottery buried deep in the sand. Others spoke of vast fields of bones, though proof was always fleeting, quickly swallowed again by the desert winds. And so the tale continues to live, not only in books of history, but in the imagination. To some, it is a cautionary story about hubris and the futility of men who thought themselves greater than nature. To others, it is a tale of divine retribution, where the gods themselves struck down the Persians for daring to trespass upon sacred ground. And to dreamers, it is simply a mystery, one that keeps the sands of Egypt alive with wonder and unease. Even today, when satellites peer down from the skies and science can probe beneath the earth, the truth remains uncertain. Was the army truly erased by a storm of unimaginable fury? Did it wander off course, dying slowly of thirst and despair? Or is the entire story, as some skeptics suggest, nothing more than legend, a tale polished by centuries of retelling? We may never know, but perhaps that is the true power of this story. The mystery of Cambyses' lost army endures because it refuses to give us answers. It lingers in the space between history and myth, fact and imagination, leaving us to wonder what really lies beneath the endless desert sands. And as night falls, and the winds of the Sahara whisper across the dunes, one can almost hear the footsteps of the soldiers who marched into the unknown, an echo across time, reminding us that some stories are meant never to be solved, but simply remembered.